We speak now to asking questions about whether should Europe, NATO and the US allies consider re-establishing relations with Russia to try and prevent the devastating global energy and cost of living crisis, or should they focus on investing more resources into defense, into countering Russia? Independent counter-terrorism and organised crime expert David Otto joins us now to provide some answers. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the programme. It's Ukraine's Independence Day from the Soviet Union today, and they're trying to celebrate, but it's a really difficult time. And the ambassador we spoke to just now says if they stop fighting, Ukraine will cease to exist. If Russia stops fighting, then there will be peace for the whole world. If that is a true assessment of the situation, what should the world be doing to try and manage this crisis?
Peter, I do understand the position of the ambassador in terms of how she sees the situation. But realistically, Peter, I don't think it's as simple as she makes it to be. I understand the very difficult challenges that Ukraine is facing since the February 24th invasion by Russia. But I don't think, as she puts it, that if Russia stops fighting, then the whole world will be peaceful, because geopolitics is not as simple as it does appear. I think we need to look further than that. It's rather unfortunate, Peter, that Ukraine is celebrating its independence, its 31st independence from the former Soviet Union, at a time when Ukraine doesn't seem to, have a, full territorial control. As we know, Russia had annexed Crimea in 2014. Taking, what was a former territory of Ukraine, and it has now a full or massive control of the Donbas region in the east and the south. So it's a very challenging one for Ukraine to be celebrating, its independence on a day when, practically it does not have a full independence of its nation. Its territorial integrity has been violated, by the Russian invasion. So it's a, it's quite challenging. I don't think, this is just about Russia or Ukraine. You've got to remember that, there is also a strategic importance of the NATO allies, the US, European Union, in this war. So it's not just about the decision. Let's be very clear about what the decision that Russia makes or the decision that Ukraine makes, because it's gone further than that. And that's the nature of war. The more that it drags on, the more it becomes complex. It's very easy to start a conflict, but it's very challenging to end it, especially when it's dragged for this long.
All right, let's talk about some of the big moves that have taken place recently. The United States helping Ukraine to the tune of $3 billion almost in a military package. What does this mean? Because some people will look at this from a distance and say the US is fighting Russia through Ukraine.
And that's what some people argue, and this is this cannot be denied entirely. This is almost like a proxy war between the United States on one hand and Russia on the other hand. This is not to underestimate or devalue the position of Ukraine in terms of the strategic importance of Ukraine to Russia. But clearly, if you look at the dynamics of this war in terms of not just that financial support, but also support in terms of providing some level of intelligence, providing training to Ukrainian forces. We've seen a very high level of media support, coming in from the West, from Europe, from the United States. and as you rightly said, all the billions and billions of US dollars and whatever currencies have been spent, and continuously. We even saw today, Peter, as NATO promises to continuously support Ukraine. So it's almost a proxy war, if I may say. And I don't see Ukraine making an independent decision as to where this war goes, because it is beyond Ukraine, even though Ukraine is a sovereign country of its own. I'll bet the fact that it has lost, some of its territories to Russia. But I don't think this is a decision that Ukraine can make because of the influence that Ukraine has had with the support of the West. We even saw the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson paying, some kind of a secret or urgent visit to the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, on the day when Ukraine is celebrating its 31st independence. And amidst, I have to mention this, cause or fears that, Russia could launch missiles, into some parts of Ukraine, in order to prevent the Ukrainians from celebrating their independence. So it's a very complex war, Peter, and the more it drags on, when 6 months, the more it becomes very challenging.
All right, so there have been, some might say, unintended consequences for Moscow. They had thought that this would be over quite quickly, that their military might would go in there, sort things out and move out. But it hasn't happened that way. And they talked about, the Crimea, Donbass as reasons for war. But in reality, I think most people accept that it was about NATO expansion. Now, they may have stopped Ukraine for now, but NATO has expanded nevertheless, with Sweden and Finland joining the party. So is there anything still in it for Russia to keep this war up?
Peter, there are so many unintended consequences, but one would have to be very careful in terms of how you frame, the strategic, outcome of, one side or the other. Now, you're very correct in the sense that when Russia launched the operations in February, even before Russia did that, remember very well that Russia denied categorically that it was planning to invade Ukraine. Now, from a military point of view, this makes sense, because of course, you don't want your enemy to know if you're going to attack them or not. The element of surprise is very key and crucial. And, Russia made it clear at the time, so it seemed, that, it will last for 3 days. But, you and I and many others know that, no such invasion, can last for that very short a time. You can measure the level of capacity that you have, but you cannot measure the level of resilience or resistance that your enemy is going to put through, or your opponent, whichever language is best. We've seen that, Russia thought it was going to be a short war, but of course, Ukraine has allies, from NATO, and this has been a win-win, perhaps for NATO, because NATO has now re-established itself. It has, been all over the place, as opposed to pre-Russian, invasion of Ukraine. We now have the possibility, Peter, of 2 new members who used to be neutral parties, and that is Sweden and Finland, becoming members of NATO. This is more or less an expansion of NATO, to which Russia was trying to avoid. Again, which comes to your point that this becomes an unintended consequence. But I think the important thing is to try and figure out what was Russia thinking. But in my opinion, Russia has continues to consolidate itself in Crimea. It continues to have an upper hand in the Donbass region. It continues to fight. But Peter, I have to say very clearly that the upcoming winter will have a very decisive factor. Will be a decisive factor to play and see who has the depth and who has the endurance, to keep on fighting.
All right, so is there a middle ground where both sides can save face and that this conflict can end?
That's a very good question, and I like that, because when this war or conflict or military operation, depending on which side of the fence you're sitting on, when it all began, significantly we had countries like South Africa calling and saying our doors are open. We can play the mediator or facilitator role. But of course, in these situations, you don't take yourself up. You've got to be accepted by both parties. Now that did not go down well, or it didn't go through. Now what we see, at this point in time, is countries like Turkey. President Erdogan has taken upon himself to negotiate with Russia and Ukraine. But to be candid, what we've seen is more negotiations leading to ceasefires, to humanitarian aid being provided, to exchange of prisoners of war. We haven't really seen any negotiation that is talking about ending the war, because of course, Russia doesn't believe that it can cede Ukraine territories of Crimea and the Donbas region to Ukraine. Ukraine also doesn't, at this point, believe that it should allow Russia to continuously take the territories, of Crimea and the Donbas region, as you saw in the speech, by Vladimir Zelensky today. So the middle ground is to find, some kind of a, who is going to accept what. I don't see Russia accepting to withdraw its forces, from Crimea and Donbas region without putting up a very strong fight. And I don't see Ukraine backing down because, of course, again, as I mentioned earlier on, Ukraine is not alone. NATO keeps pumping money and military support, into this fight. So so far, it is as dark as the upcoming winter.
That's where we'll leave it for today. Always good talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us, my brother.
Thank you.
All right, so that's one of our regular commentators commenting and talking about this the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which has gone on now for 6 months, and as it becomes more complex, an end doesn't seem in sight. But Ukraine getting huge support from the international community, America giving them $3 billion worth of aid there. And as our commentator was saying, perhaps the coming winter might be telling on both sides.